So today we heard from some very good dynamic speakers, very good content, as Garwin just said. And the information that came today is in exactly the way we intended it to be. No spin, give you the raw data without the sensationalization of any other thing behind it, except just to tell you exactly what our speakers felt and feel are the issues that are impacting our economy today. So what we'd like to do is reflect on what at least these three speakers had to say to us this morning and allow you now to raise any questions that you might have of our speakers so that we can get this conversation started. All right, so are there any questions for any of our panelists? The floor is open. I'm not going to take much of your time trying to pose my own questions, but I'm going to ask you, please. If you have any questions or comments, we'll start with David. And Senator, when you speak, please identify yourself and your company so that we can record you properly.
Thank you. David Slato, Family Guardian. I've got two questions. The first one is for Jaco. In your presentation, you showed the correlation between the U.S. GDP growth and Bahamian GDP growth, and that strong correlation historically until 2012. Then you noted there was a decoupling. Do you have any explanation for why there was that decoupling of the correlation between the two GDP growths?
I can speculate. I think some of the shocks that you've had would have impacted that. I think construction is an area that is probably not, is idiosyncratic, is specific to the Bahamas. You had the Bahamar experience as part of that, probably would have impacted sort of domestic business confidence. I think, let me just add that about this time last year, we received some of those data from the Department of Statistics on GDP growth in 2014 and 15. There was a large downward revision. And I think at the time we were a little bit surprised. Not the direction, in the sense that we had anticipated that growth would be weaker, but the fact that growth was so negative was a surprise to us. So that's, as a way of explanation, I think the best I can do at the moment.
Thank you. The next question is for Governor Roll. I guess kind of the idea of dollarization. You mentioned that for that to occur, there would need to be a significant increase in foreign reserves to make that happen. We hear a lot of talk about Bahamians having substantial foreign reserves abroad. Is there any consideration given to exchange control regulatory change that would make it possible for these sums to be brought back into the country, increasing foreign reserves, and therefore perhaps accelerating the concept of dollarization?
Well, it's an area that we've had a lot of conversations around. I think we need to research it as a medium-term project. Having those resources come back here still doesn't really solve the problem in terms of whether the banks will embrace that liquidity and how they would deploy the liquidity. So I don't think the challenge would really be getting the money in. The question is, have we identified how we would deploy it? And if we have, then there is no restrictions against some of those resources coming back in today. Some of this should be coming in voluntarily. But I suppose also in your question would be the idea that you bring in foreign currency facilities and you keep the money in US dollars.
So, correct.
And then you're also now telling the banks, you have to deploy these in US dollars, because that's not necessarily my headache unless the banks have to convert it. There would not be any necessary conversion there. So it wouldn't necessarily go into the foreign reserves unless the banks converted it into B-dollar liquidity for lending, which I don't think would be the best of ideas. So we have to tie it to investments.
Thank you.
Thank you. We talked about, and you raised this issue of de-risking. And I know we talked about it before, and we talked about the fact that the central bank didn't necessarily have a major concern about it because you felt that we still have a very strong system. But how realistic is it for us to expect that at some point there may be this risk of de-risking in the Bahamas, and if it is an imminent threat, what should we be doing now to prepare ourselves to mitigate against it or even try to subvert it some way?
No, I think in a case like the Bahamas, the concern would be the disproportionate impact on categories of banks and possibly forcing the channeling of more of the transactions through the banks that continue to have access to the international markets. In the domestic economy, in some respect, we could probably manage with fallout a lot easier than in the offshore sector, because in the offshore sector, if your standalone business model is compromised, then you could be undermining the viability of certain operations. And I know that there have been isolated cases in, I think Antigua is one example, where the banks have had to close down if they lost all of their connections. So for the offshore sector or the international sector, we definitely want to make sure that you preserve those access. And you have to approach it on multiple fronts. One of them is the cost, providing the repricing of the banking services. But we know too that the concerns around the risk of being accused of criminal behavior is a big one. And so for certain correspondent bank providers, the decision is easy for them to withdraw completely. And so we have to focus a lot more on trying to get the risk profile of the jurisdiction reduced.
Okay, Gowan?
The main challenge that probably in terms of explaining it is that this is a business decision versus what I would call a OECD policy initiative. The IMF, World Bank, and others have actually formally come out and said that this is one that they encourage the correspondent banks to carefully consider, because it could create instability, particularly in the Caribbean region. It is a very real threat, but more so from a business perspective, and that's one I'll talk to. We get labeled with the AML, counterterrorism financing initiatives and the offshore center having been used before. But in reality, the Bahamas and a lot of the Caribbean are just small transaction-based economies. And a lot of the larger correspondent banks are saying that, the risk of me doing business in these ones, I only earn X amount. But if I get fined by the Department of Justice or someone else, that's multiples of what I earned there. So if I'm only earning $1 million or $2 million out of the Bahamas, and a fine could be 50 million, 100 million, then my business decision is I will call it de-risking, I will call it AML, but in reality I'm making a business decision that I will stay and do business where economically the cost-benefit analysis is more positive. For us it's very real, and I think John alluded to it, and I think the appreciation is that the Bahamian dollar economy would not necessarily be impacted because the banks already clear amongst themselves as it relates to B-dollar. It really impacts when we talk about credit cards, which are going to be foreign currency settled in terms of US dollar, the wire transactions, and we do a lot of import. So everything that we do is importing. So as it relates to having the banking system with that access, that is going to remain critical in that regard. So this is the one time the Bahamas, we always get accused of saying we don't want to be in the Caribbean. We don't want to be labeled as the negativity of the Caribbean, but we have to be a part of it in terms of, as John said, the collective response. But we want to demonstrate that our system, our process, and our regulation is of the highest order so that the business decision becomes less risky, because it simply says, well, there should be no risk of you getting hit in a situation with a bad transaction. And that is a very difficult sell, but it is one that we have to work collectively with Central Bank and the other regulators to make sure that we put that image forward.
Okay. Do you have a perspective, Jakob?
Maybe just two additional comments on that. I think that the point about profitability is key. Certainly when you talk to the correspondent banks, they will say that given the small transaction volume, does not provide them with the profit, the opportunities to make profit from this activity. So in terms of having dialogue between the correspondent banks and the banks here in the Bahamas about what might be the options for the local banks to increase profitability of this big business. Now, increasing in fees is an obvious one, but perhaps there are other ways to do it in terms of consolidating services, for example, such that the correspondent bank may have a different service that it provides to the local bank that provides profits for them, and therefore they are more willing to maintain the relationship. So I think that would be the one point, sort of look within the industry for solutions that might help make the correspondent banking a more profitable business. Another area of that could be lowering costs. Perhaps there's some technological solutions that could help. The other perspective just on the offshore, and I think we do hear that from the correspondent banks, that there is a somewhat higher standard when there is an offshore activity involved, and that you just need to be extra vigilant in terms of implementing the standards that you have in place.
Okay, thank you. David?
Sorry, I held off, gave everybody else a chance. One question on extreme events. When it comes to risk management, you need to look at extreme events. And while the probability may be very low, the reality, we have what we call fat tails in probabilities. And an extreme event like Hurricane Matthew being a Category 5 and not a 4, and the eye being 30 miles further east than it was, would be an extreme event. If that had happened, and tourism on New Providence was shut down for an extended period of time, are we in a position to survive such an event? I mean, we talk about foreign reserves being 3 months of imports. If you strip out the $120 million of foreign interest payments we owe every year, if you strip out profitability repayments required by foreign institutions, how many months of imports do we really have? And have we, as a group, private sector, the public sector, the foreign consultants, sat down and analyzed that and determined what are the policies we need to put in place to deal with such an event? September 11th again, hurricane Category 5. I mean, these are extreme, unlikely events, but they have to be considered and factored in.
Well, the short answer is if it were Category 5 last year, unless you were on the coast, you probably would still be in this room today. Now, we'd probably have a whole heap of extra debt on our books. But the point there is that when those events happen, you expect to get a huge financial setback, and you expect that there's somebody available who will give you a line of credit. We could survive one next year and probably the year after that, but probably not the third or the fourth year. So that is your motivation for why you work very assiduously to keep your debt level low and to get it lower, so that in those unfortunate cases, you can bounce back. And yes, we probably would have been knocking on our good friend's door, depending on the severity of it, because then he'd have to give me some liquidity for the reserves. But those are your contingencies. But that's why you have to also make sure that you keep your debt burden at a lower level.
And I think what I'll add to that is you're absolutely right that we now have to start planning that. In various regulated entities, you have that built in. So in the banking sector, the capital adequacy, in the insurance sector, the capital adequacy, and the ones to say build it in. Does the government have a capital adequacy analysis or stress test? And maybe not in a formal setting, but it is one that certainly when we are being faced with those types of events, businesses know that they react. So whether it's insurance cover, the quality of standard of the building, the bunkering, or whatever it is to prepare itself and protect against being out for an extended period of time. A lot of people learn to buy more generators, right? Or generator capacity just by the one that passes. I think when we look at the government, this is when it in reality is the private sector working with them. So how do we look at the insurance product as an example to create catastrophe cover that the government can actually purchase? It's just a thought, right? There are countries like Brazil that have created basically where all of the cat cover is actually done by a national company, if you will, and the insurance companies buy from it. I think when we are fortunate to come through these events, it's the gut check time to say, well, what do we do to make sure that the next time it comes, we are better prepared, one, financially, two, infrastructurally, but three, mindset-wise as well. And I think that's going to be one as an ongoing dialogue. It's not one that I would say we're satisfied with when you say the private sector, because certainly private sector want to make sure that government services get up as quickly as possible, but they also want their own. So this is something we should work together with NEMA and other agencies to make sure it's done, and that is taking place. The Chamber and NEMA has already forged a very strong relationship to start looking at some of those elements.
I think the other thing that I should mention is the high income that we have in the Bahamas per capita does mean that level of private insurance is perhaps higher than in some other countries in the Caribbean. So one of the protection that we already have is that the private sector, particularly on an island like this, you typically fall back on your insurance claims, and we get substantial amount of reinsurance inflows. Even in the case of the present hurricanes, where I think the numbers was estimated at a few $100 million, most of that was New Providence. And fortunate for those insurance underwriters, the damage in New Providence was not as severe as it could have been, because you could very well have had a few multiples of that over in terms of claims. So the reinsurance element for the Bahamas does provide some protection, and I think looking at it from the point of view of insurance is also very important.
Lyndon?
Yeah, Lyndon Nairn. Having two questions, really. The first has to do with the balance of payments. I know that, Governor, you mentioned that the errors and omissions are quite significant, and I agree with you. As a matter of fact, if one were to analyze the errors and omissions on the balance of payments, what one observes is that between 2007 and 2012, the errors and omissions were about $500 million, which one would, I think, reasonably expect because Bahamians would have a tendency to go to Miami without purchasing foreign exchange from the banks. And in fact, but what we observed between 2007 and 2000, and am I getting my dates right, 2007 to 2016, is that the errors and omissions were about $2.5 billion, and pointing to the possibility that foreign currency came into the country that was not properly accounted for. So it went in the reverse of what was historic. So one might say that essentially we had a $3 billion unexplained event. For me, that is a major item of concern, and I'm wondering whether both the governor and Yako would have any thoughts with respect to that. My second question relates to government foreign currency borrowing. For 45 years, the Bahamas amassed foreign currency borrowing of about $800 million. And the last 4 years, that our foreign currency borrowing increased by $1 billion and now stands at $1.8 billion. What is quite interesting is that that incremental increase is the same as effectively our foreign reserves. And one wonders, given that reality, that our foreign currency, that our foreign reserves are not really organic, whether we should be whether we should be excited about the level of our foreign currency, foreign reserves, or whether we should have some concern about it.
Well, I would say this: if you look at the historical data, you should be able to convince yourself that the majority of the reserves represent net inflows, private sector inflows. not net inflows through the public sector. So there are two sides to those flows, and for the most part, it's just coincidental that you get the numbers that look the same. It's not to say, like I said earlier, that if you have an imbalanced strategy in the public sector, you could have a misuse in terms of the amount of the impact of the government transactions on the reserves. But the only way the government of the Bahamas can borrow, and it has happened repeatedly, you can check the data, the only way the government of the Bahamas can borrow $1 billion more in the domestic economy is if the private sector is allowed to borrow $1 billion less. And most of the flow of funds equation there. So what happens in the public sector is not independent of the private sector. So the outcome in terms of the net effect on the reserves is always taken into account some of the adjustment, whether voluntarily or imposed on the private sector. And often when the government borrows externally in the context of sustainability, it is in recognition of the fact that given the private sector's domestic liquidity needs, both cannot be satisfied at the same time. So you can't look at a tranche of it and without looking at what's happening elsewhere. In terms of the errors and omission, there are many issues related. I think part of it is just data coverage on the inflows. Use Bahamas as an example. Bahamas, on restarting, had, I think, according to the reports, more than $200 million worth of financing activities, which basically amounted to debt settling. I can assure you that a flow like that probably shows up in errors and omission in the sense that if a project is developing and is bringing in construction material, customs is reporting the import. So you have lots of imports, which in some cases are well recorded, but you're not seeing the financing. The other area where, perhaps not on the same scale, you have some mismatch is that a lot of our, I call residential tourism developments, we record in our balance of payment a property purchase. But if that property is purchased and then developed, and development is financed by resources from outside, we see the goods coming in, but we don't see the financing because the financing didn't have to flow through our system, and that's not someone who would have to file a report to the central bank. Only the large enterprises, foreign-owned enterprises, will typically do direct reporting on their transactions. And so in those cases, we tend to get reasonable, good understanding of what's happening. But for the private individual-driven transactions, which are significant in an economy like this, you miss out on them. And then, as you're suggesting, if the inflows are not going through the banking system, and there's probably a very large float that is in this economy, we see the expenditure, but we don't see when the inflows are realized. So I think those are some of the reasons why the errors and omissions are as large as they are. But I should caution that we've had periods in the distant past when sometimes they were negative, meaning that perhaps you could assume that some of the inflows were estimated perhaps too aggressively. But I think tourism expenditure too also needs some look at in terms of how we're estimating that total estimate of tourism expenditure.
Jaco?
Yeah, maybe just to add a little bit. Of course, this is about financing the large current account deficits that we have seen persisting over the past few years. And one trend that wasn't mentioned here, one trend that we've seen is the decline in foreign direct inflows, FDI inflows. That used to be a big part of the financing of the current account deficits, and it is much less so. This has been historically a relatively stable source of financing. This source of financing has been replaced by government borrowing to some extent and by other private capital flows, including errors and omissions. Now, I think you could make an argument, and we have made that argument in our what we call exchange rate assessment, that compared to the FDI inflows, some of these inflows related to other private capital are potentially at least less reliable. So I think it's a risk, and we've identified it as a risk in our report.
And the only thing I would conclude is we don't sit and talk about it. We talk a lot about deficit, debt. We don't speak about the balance of payments. And so there's a naivety, not using the term in a derogatory sense, from the general populace. And so I think it's important that we now start saying, well, have an understanding of what the current account and capital account mean. Where are the primary sources? And what are the things that we need to do as a society? Because we always look at it in terms of saying it's a monetary policy decision or a fiscal policy decision, but in terms of consumption, persons who shop abroad don't understand the impact that that has in terms of, as you said, pulling U.S. currency out of the market, spending abroad versus shopping locally where it's still being bought, and the elements that are circulating in the economy here are dependence on imports and whether we can produce more locally, whether we can take advantage of sustainable development here, and why initiatives like fisheries, agriculture, and other sort of micro business opportunities may benefit it. And it's because we don't have that conversation. So when we start talking about our fiscal success in the future, we also need to bear in mind that it has the consequence of saying the things that we do as it relates to the US dollar, our currency peg, and the balance of payments. And so it's just elevating the debate, but keeping it simple.
Thank you. Question?
Felicia Bouillard, Executive Business Solutions. And this first question is for Diaco. You mentioned in your presentation that you're expected to grow at approximately 1% over the next 5 years. How does this compare to other similar economies? Are we on par, or are we lower than those economies? And the second question, you also mentioned in your presentation that you made several recommendations to the government after reviews. If you're at liberty, can you expand on how those were received and whether you see indications that they're being properly acted upon? And my third question is for Governor and potentially Gowan. It was initially for Simon, but he's not here. Now we see that Governor mentioned in his presentation that non-performing loans are in the double digits still. And we also see that the cruise ships, we saw a recent newspaper article where it's moving out from the Bahamas and moving to Cuba. Now, Simon mentioned that the numbers may not be a true reflection of where we lie based on the numbers that he sees. But if we still have non-performing loans in the double digits and a potential shift in revenue, do you see this as worrisome? Is this a negative indicator, or how would you elaborate? Thank you very much.
All right. As regards the first question, whether our estimate of potential growth of between 1 and 1.5, how does that compare internationally? Now, the trend that I showed you in that chart of a declining potential output growth is really a trend that you see in many other countries. In fact, in our report, we use some of the same methods to estimate potential output growth in a few other tourism-dependent Caribbean economies, and we see a similar decline. You do the same exercise for the United States, you will also see a decline over time. So there is a strong common element here. It'd be good to know better what's driving that, but certainly there's almost an international phenomena of lower medium-term potential growth. And there's, of course, literature on that and discussion. In terms of how that rate compares, the range that I mentioned between 1 and 1.5, that's lower than the US. The current estimates from the IMF on the potential growth of the US is about 2%. If I recall correctly, some of the other Caribbeans would have had somewhat higher growth rates than the Bahamas, including Jamaica, where I think we've seen a more of an increase in the estimated potential output growth over the past few years. In terms of the discussion with the authorities, I would say we've always had very constructive discussions. There was always some back and forth. There's always also a counter argument from the authorities' side, and we consider those very carefully. In terms of whether they have acted upon our recommendations, I would say in many cases we are on the same page in terms of the direction of policies. For example, I think the credit bureau is something that has come up in our discussions over years and years. Now it's being set up. I say that we are often in agreement in the direction. Sometimes we are impatient. We would like to see the authorities moving faster in some of these areas, including structural reforms, which of course, I'll admit it, that they're difficult things to achieve in many cases.
Thank you, Governor.
So you asked a question about the cruise line and what it means?
Basically, is it a negative indicator in comparison?
Not necessarily, unless you have all of the particulars. And from my experience, I think what something like that may also speak to is that we need more definition around the incentive regime often for these activities in terms of the cost-benefit analysis. I have very strong personal views about cruise industry in terms of how you develop it. So we could potentially, the Bahamas, triple the return from the cruise sector with a third less cruise arrivals than are currently coming here because of the incentives we provide to cruise passengers to spend money in the destination. So I think the number or the head count isn't really the best indicator of how the industry is performing. Another interesting trend too is that over the decade plus or more, last decade plus or more, you also saw the cruise ships getting more into their private, destinations. And the Bahamas has gotten a lot of attention from that too. So even within the Bahamas, there's competition among destinations in terms of where the cruise lines call. But I mean, there are probably some quick wins in terms of the city of Nassau that we can focus on. My philosophy is that I want to develop Nassau and the Bahamas for me first, and if they come, then they can enjoy what I'm enjoying. That, I think, is part of the reason why fish fry was successful. Fish fry was developed for Bahamians. And so Bahamians, the attraction of going to that is that you get to experience, or you used to get to experience what we used to experience, but it's changed character now. So I don't know if Bahamians get the same experience if they need to. I went there the other day, no conch fritters, right? No cracked conch. So what else are you going to order? No, but the bottom line is that some of the improvements that we need in terms of what I call quality of life improvements in this island, if we focus on the inhabitants of the island, they would provide more than ample spillover benefits that would increase the attractiveness of the cruise product.
All right, thank you. Colin, you want to wrap up on that?
Yeah, and the only thing you mentioned was like the NPLs and the indicators in it. I think it's understanding them in their context. So is our unemployment number, or are our unemployment numbers positive? No. And so the sentiment on the street is there is activity and people are getting job opportunities. Are they permanent? Are they temporary? Are they the sustainable ones? And are we creating what I would call jobs that are attractive, as opposed to filling a void and gap in certain elements. And on the NPLs, really we have to, that's the balance between trying to legislate morality. So how much of that is persons not paying because of a belief that they will be given the opportunity not to pay because of pending legislation versus the inability to pay. And so there is a delicate balance that says There's the need to protect the consumer, but certainly as a private sector representative, of course, I'm going to say the best way you protect the consumer is by educating them, not by legislating what businesses do with them. And so persons can use their feet to determine how a business reacts. And so a large part of what we call consumer protection or citizen protection is sometimes actually counterproductive to what you want to achieve, because I think you see that businesses react, always bearing in mind that a business is a group of investors that has put capital into a venture for the purposes of making a return. If I cannot make a return, there's no free lunch. So if I lose money, that business venture pulls out. So you want to balance to say that I allow businesses to make a reasonable profit, and I balance that by reasonable regulation and by consumer education.
Okay, thank you. So this is our last question, and then we're going to wrap after this last question.
Good afternoon, Alan Butler from Miley Butler and Sons. I asked the question, what can we do in this country in reference to being able to service other entities other than just through tourism as we know it, be hotels or whatever have you? What are the revenue streams does the Bahamas have available to it that we can actually use or try to develop, whether it be a good or whether it be a service, that our historical data has actually shown us that we can really do well and compete competitively in the rest of the world without losing our shirt. So we can have some other revenue streams other than what we've really been focusing on for so many years, or running a panic on because we figure that Cuba's coming on stream or whatever have you. What else do we have available for us that we can actually do, or that we could develop here within our small grouping of the Chamber of Commerce, whatever have you, that we can actually do to try to develop? That's one question. The other question is, if any of you could answer, how will NHI affect us? Thank you.
I think that the first one, because I guess a lot of what you said is private sector driven. We cannot box ourselves into our traditional sort of product offering. The Bahamas, whether we are candid with ourselves or not, the reality is tourism and financial services were industries that were implemented in the 50s, 60s. And whilst they have changed somewhat, there hasn't been what I would call a revolution in terms of that, and the world is catching up. So the same way we developed those or looked at our natural resources is saying, how do we take advantage? Freeport, we've heard a lot about, right? That's the sort of straw that breaks the camel's back in terms of saying the infrastructure, the free trade zone, the large shipping channels, logistics, et cetera, how we exploited the ability to do so. In terms of what the technology has enabled, what are we prepared to invest in locally in terms of providing service? So given an example, just using some of our competitor jurisdictions quickly, Cayman, Bermuda, and others, you know, they just found a niche market, and they did everything from private sector, government, and even the citizens at large that drove towards how you build that. The BFSB, in its overall initiative that is being supported by the Chamber, saying, well, how do we take our niche, which is wealth management, and create new product lines so that things flow in? The debate, I would throw back to you, is what are you seeing that can come to the Chamber that can be an advocacy group to build it out broader? Because what we should be looking at now is saying there's no monopoly in the minds that sit as directors at the time or the members of the Chamber, that each and every individual member and persons that participate can throw ideas. What they can't throw is just a bone and run. They have to throw an idea and say, how do we develop it? And I will then become a champion to work with the institution to say, how do we champion it forward? And so from that perspective, I think our problem is we are too educated to believe that we can't do something else. We should actually lose that education and say, well, why is there any restriction on what we can do? So be like a child who just knows no boundary, right?
think you asked the second question. Sorry, you want to respond?
Just maybe add to that. I think the question of how to diversify small economies is a very difficult one. There aren't a lot of examples out there of economies that have successfully done that. So certainly you have to have a private sector environment that is enabling for private sector to grow and to go into new directions, whether it's the financial services sector or perhaps I would say sectors that can provide more value added to the tourism product. I think tourism will remain as your main, certainly export product. So in that sense, I think a lot, and I think somebody mentioned it, a lot can be gained from adding more domestic value added to the tourism product.
Okay. I know you asked about NHI. I'm not sure we have time to get into NHI today because that's a whole other discussion. And if you want to get a direct answer, the gentleman sitting in the back, talk to Derek Osborne. Derek sits on the, I just put him on the spot. Derek chairs the Chamber's division on the NHI review. So if you want to get some information, he's the man to talk to today. All right. Do you have any closing comments, gentlemen, before we wrap this? Because I promised 1 o'clock. It's about 3 minutes after 1. So I want to hold true to my word. Governor, you want to give some closing comments, or you?
No, I mean, I'll just say the final comment in relation to how we should see ourselves when we get these international peer comparisons is that we have very good intentions. We are sincere with our intentions. But in those international peer assessment, intentions count for nothing in terms of points awarded, because you've probably seen and heard it 1,000 times over, going from capital to capital. We will get the credit that we deserve, or we believe we deserve, when we start to demonstrate in terms of some of the reforms that we've agreed that we need to follow through on. So the most important thing is to appreciate getting the reforms through in areas that are vital to make a difference, because then the country will begin to be perceived in a different light in terms of some of its structural issues and challenges. So that is very important, and is going to become super critical in the context of the National Development Plan, which I'm sure for some of you, if you went to sleep in 1970 and you just woke up today, some of those things may sound familiar still. So execution in terms of the reforms are very critical for a country like the Bahamas. And a small country, I think it's very easy to build consensus than in many of the others. So that would be my closing.
Thank you.
The last sentence of the governor's closing statement could be mine as well. I think there's a lot of positives in this country. I did a review of many of the difficult issues, but at the same time, there are many positives in this country, and I think events like this demonstrate that there is the private sector participation and the will to move things forward, and I'm very happy to have been a part of a discussion that I think is very important.
Chairman?
And I go back to the prayer of serenity, but from the perspective of saying we have to just be courageous. There's nothing that we cannot change, and we just have to demonstrate patience for the things that are not easy to change. And I think from that perspective, it's a beautiful little country that everyone wants to come to. So we need to open our eyes and see the beauty and the dynamism that exists, and take advantage of it for ourselves and stop complaining about others that take advantage of it.
Fantastic. Let's give our panelists a round of applause, please. Thank you all very much. A very insightful conversation, and I want to thank them for being a part of this panel discussion today. I want to thank you for staying until 1 o'clock with us this afternoon. I trust you found the information very useful. And thank you all for coming out today, and you'll be hearing from the Chamber very shortly. And thank you so much for your support. Have a wonderful day.